And we are live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are calling in from. I'm very excited as always. This is welcome to shifting from grudge to grit, grace, and gratitude. I'm just pressing live. We don't have any Instagram challenges today, so we can have our audience on Instagram join us as well. Please don't hesitate to engage as you so beautifully do every week with your wonderful insights and comments. Today's topic is going to be one that is actually close to my heart, believe it or not, and something I feel should be spoken more about, which is death and dying. Now, you might think this is quite somber, and why would I be so excited about it? Because for me, it's around how do we celebrate the people that we grieve and that we lose along the way, or how do we have these direct conversations, as I just said to Yvonne, with our family that are with us in this present moment, and having these actual conversations when it's such a taboo topic and most don't like to talk about it. So we'll explore ways to navigate challenging emotions that come up with loss and end of life moments. You'll hear from Yvonne, who journeyed through the pain of many losses, but yet emerged with a renewed sense of purpose and appreciation for life. We hope to gain perspectives on how to transform these feelings of possible resentment or anger into resilience and inner peace. Hopefully, also learn some strategies to cultivate grace and gratitude, even in the face of life's most difficult moments. So, I'm going to just read a little bit to introduce Yvonne, and then we'll move over to Jamila. Thanks, Jamila, also, as always, for being here, as much as we know we have these busy schedules. So Yvonne is a psychotherapist, corporate trainer, and a consultant. She's been a teacher and the head of a human resource department in a retirement community. She has a master's degree in education and clinical psychology. She is also the author, because I'm thinking about the daughter of the dad, yeah, the author of Flying with Dad, a daughter, a father, and the hidden gifts in his stories from World War II and Dying with Dad. Tough talks for easier endings. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jamila just to greet everyone, and then to you, Yvonne, to kick us off with this beautiful story.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be back. Still recovering, unfortunately, from the flu, which doesn't seem to be letting go. There's so many people that are suffering with this, and it's just been ongoing, lasting for about 3 to 6 weeks. But I'm grateful still to be able to be here, and I'm even more grateful to be in the presence of my beautiful co-host, but especially to our lovely guest today. And it's definitely a topic that a lot of us tend to deal with just on our own or not deal with. But I think in sharing our experiences and in sharing our stories and our losses and the emotions that we feel, we are able to be better equipped to deal with it. And it's something that we are guaranteed to have experienced at some time in our life or another. So very grateful and very keen to hear what you have to say, Yvonne. And without any further ado, please tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I am now what I call deliciously semi-retired. My very last position was in the retirement community, and retirement has meant that I could write 2 books. I could bring 2 books to the public. But prior to that, as you said, I was a teacher and then a psychotherapist and a corporate trainer, and spent my last 2 years in a retirement community where I learned a great deal about death and dying. As a matter of fact, one of the stories that's instrumental to all of this is that in the organization that I was in, we had an ethics committee, and I was a member of the ethics committee. And we had a case that was brought before us for a resident who was in deep dementia, could no longer speak for herself. She developed an abscess on her foot, and the doctor wanted to treat it with antibiotics and whirlpool baths. However, Her daughter, who was then her power of attorney and who could speak for her mother, said, just let it go. And the problem that created was that what the mother had signed off on in an advance directive was quality of care. That or quality of life, if her life had no quality left, she just wanted to be let go. The problem was the state of Pennsylvania, where I lived, did not have that in an advance directive. So we couldn't follow those wishes. And the case ended up in court. And the court decided that a surrogate would be provided for the dementia resident to allow for the whirlpool baths and the antibiotics. And should that not work, then the daughter could step in and say no to an amputation. So my father was at home. Fragile diabetic. And it occurred to me, did Dad have an advance directive? Did Dad have a legal document that should he become incapacitated, somebody could step in for him? So I called him on the phone and he said, what's that? Now he had a will. Once I explained to Dad what it was, Dad, this is a document that would say, yes, I want this treatment. No, I don't want this treatment. It would talk very much about, if you could no longer speak for yourself, that one of your children could end up following whatever your wishes were. So if I schedule an appointment with an attorney, I'll drive home 6.5 hours, okay? And you and I'll go to the attorney and we'll just get the document done. Is that okay with you? And he said, sure. So we sat down with the attorney and we went through it and we had all the paperwork signed and we made it legal. And that felt really pretty good until one of the managers in our retirement community came back from a conference, and in her hand, she had this document called the 5 Wishes. And the 5 Wishes is an advance directive, but it really brings out a whole lot more than a normal advance directive would do. A normal one would say who is the healthcare agent, and then it would say what kind of treatment you want or you don't want. What the 5 Wishes did was, how do you want to be remembered? How comfortable do you want to be? What do you want your children to know? Do you want to be buried or do you want to be cremated? What kind of a funeral do you like or would you like? So here I have this document that is alerting me to all kinds of things that Dad and I hadn't talked about. So I planned to go back to see him. I had the document sitting on the front seat and I kind of was fretting the whole way. My father could get angry very quickly. And so I was really leery that he would do, what do we need to do this for? Don't we have enough now? And when I walked into the hospital room, he was in the hospital again. The mood was just not what I expected. So I introduced the idea and he said, sure, let's do it. So he shifted his legs off the side of the bed, patted a spot where I could come and sit next to him. We used his tray that had had his meal on it, and we went question by question by question. It is one of the most beautiful, intimate moments I have ever experienced in my life. When it was done, in the state of Pennsylvania, all it really required was 2 witnesses to his signature. So I went out to the desk. A really good friend had come in at that time. He signed his name in this clear, crisp signature. They also signed, and I had the document. 6 years later, I had to use the document. Dad had been in the hospital again. We had just been out to visit him. The social worker came to me and said, "When can we send your dad home?" And I said, "As soon as he's ready." He had in-home care, the neighbors across the street. So I left it at that. We had been home no more than 3 or 4 hours. Then my father was on the phone. And the phone was out here because that's how loud he was yelling. "What did you tell him?" Just going on and on about he didn't feel ready to come home from the hospital. So I let him vent. And when he was through, I said, "Dad, I said you could come home when you're not, if you were ready. Doesn't sound like you are." Then he got really, really soft. And for the first time in my life, he apologized to me. He said, "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry I yelled at you." And I said, "It's okay. You were just venting." And then he added, "Yvonne, I'm scared. Can you come home?" And I said, "I'll be there tomorrow." I was home for no more than 2 hours and he was gone. But it happened exactly the way he had told me he wanted it to happen. We found him, my neighbor and I found him beside the dresser in bed in his bedroom. And not being a nurse, I called the EMTs because I had no idea what kind of state he was in. The EMT and I were able to pull him out and put him at the end of the bed on the floor. And then they started working. And I said, no, that's not what he wants. And I went and got the 5 wishes. And one of the EMTs said, "Well, these are too old." And I don't believe that to be true anymore. But then I got on the phone and I called the hospital and I said, "There's a do not resuscitate chart on Dad's chart. Get it to the emergency room." By grace, the EMT doctor called and said to the EMTs, "You can stop working on him." So I laid down beside him. I put my arm across his chest. I told him that I loved him. I told him he was going to be with my mother. And then I did what was the glue in our family, the Lord's Prayer. And he was gone. And for you and your audience, my father's wish was to be carried feet first out of his own home. So if you can visualize a gurney and the feet are the first that go out, they parked the gurney right by the ambulance and the doors were open wide and it was snowing an inch an hour and the light shone on Dad's face and there was this soft, sweet smile. And I went, "Yes!" And the EMTs looked at me like anything I might have had in terms of any kind of sense had long gone. But I said to them, my dad's final wish was to be carried feet first out of his own home. And you have done just that. So that's basically the topic of the second book, Dying with Dad. And my passion is for all of us to have those conversations with our children because they mean everything. They just mean everything.
I've got goosebumps listening to this story because before we came on, I was telling Yvonne that I'm often having these conversations with my kids and saying to them as a single mom, it's not easy and I would love for them to understand the importance of independence and not codependence within a family unit, and that I have an expiration date like everybody else has. So to be able to have this beautiful exchange, which in what sounds like you thought it was going to be the opposite of a beautiful exchange, getting to the point of the wish list, it almost came full circle that you could, those many years later, 6 years later, grant that wishes. And with the light shining on him with the snow, and it's beautiful. It's almost like confirmation and a thank you from Dad. Well, that's at least how I'm perceiving it. So it's, I'm in awe because it's a taboo subject and nobody wants to have it. But I certainly think that you've inspired me to have a different conversation with my kids in terms of my needs. Maybe what we could do is afterwards, I want to put those questions into the comment section so that whoever wants to go back and reflect on those questions or adapt it accordingly, or at least just give them a starting point for a conversation. I think it would be really wonderful to kind of carry on this work that you're doing. Hello, Ronald.
There, I understand that the 5 wishes is legal, not only in the it's legal in 42 states in the United States, but it's legal in some countries as well. But it's a $5 American dollar purchase, and you can get it online at www.5wishes.org. And it's a blue paper pamphlet, and it has all those questions in it. I'll give you some examples because my father was a character. When we came to the question, Dad, do you want your organs to be donated? His response was, hell no. I'm old and they're rotten, and who would want them anyway? then when we got to the part of the funeral, my father was Roman Catholic, and he wanted a high mass, and he wanted my husband to sing, and he wanted us kids to choose whatever we wanted to read. I had been taking voice lessons, so he said to me, you will sing as well. But then it got to this. He said, you know that part where they talk about you at your funeral? He said, I don't want that. If folks haven't told me to my face how they feel about me, then they damn well better not tell me during my funeral. So it was those kinds of very intimate things. One of the questions was, Dad, how do you want to be remembered? And I was sure he was going to say World War II, but he didn't. He said, my work with the Red Cross. So in writing the maybe like 3rd draft of the first book, Flying with Dad, I thought, I don't know anything about this. What did he mean by his work with the Red Cross? And so I started digging, and I drove to the local office that would have maybe had records on Dad. We're digging through stuff, and the manager of the office came to me, and she said, you won't believe what I found. There was my father's name in a brochure for a dinner, an annual dinner, 41 years of volunteering for the Red Cross. 41 years of volunteering for the Red Cross. And I knew that it started when he volunteered for the 1959 flood in my little hometown that was catastrophic. So these kinds of things started to come out. When I asked him, what do you want your children to know? He said, I want them to know that I love them. I want them to know that the best thing in my life was having kids. Never heard that kind of thing from him before. So that's what this document does. They lay out statements, and you read the statement, and if you don't want it, you put a line through it. And the background history is that it was written by Jim Toohey. And Toohey was the attorney for Mother Teresa in the United States. He had had an opportunity to visit Mother Teresa in India. And that got him on this journey of dying with dignity. And he came back to the United States, and he worked on, with attorneys and with other folks, producing what I now call the 5 wishes.
Mm.
So it's something that I'm sure you can order.
Jamila,
That's
you on
amazing.
mute?
Yes, I've just unmuted myself now. Yvonne, what a beautiful story. And what a beautiful gift to both you and your dad, um, to each other, to be able to have these conversations and to have them from a space of love and understanding and considering a way forward from this. But it's also just such a lovely tribute to his life. So I think, and that's a gift that would just keep on giving continuously for you. It allows you also to have such beautiful closure from your loss. And it's the one thing that we are guaranteed of in life, and that is death. And we so often just don't want to speak about it. We're so resistant to even think about it at times. But when you look at it in this light, it brings such a beautiful meaning to the life that the person has had. And I just love your story or your relation to me about the charity work that your dad did, and about him serving for 41 years. And that is truly the essence of charity, isn't it? They say in the scriptures that what your left hand does, your right hand shouldn't know about. And that's basically what he did. He gave and he served, and he did it purely for, the goodness and the purity and servitude for his creator. And that's how, I mean, Anissa, I think that's just absolutely amazing. This is something that we should all strive to be in our lives. And, that for me is the definition of a successful life. I remember my mom, before she passed away, just 2 weeks before she passed away, we were speaking about death. And it was totally unrelated, because we didn't know that a month from them that she was going to pass. And she had just come back from a friend's funeral, and she said, do not ever be afraid of death. The thing that you should always keep at the back of your mind is that you take nothing with you but your good deeds. And that is so, so true. And they're words to live by, I feel, words that your dad most certainly did live by.
He certainly did. He told me stories, and that's another thing in terms of my relationship with him. We were on the phone one night, and he told me a quirky, funny, off-the-wall story about being in World War II. Making an emergency landing in Fried, Belgium, with the third engine out. And the third engine on his plane was the source of hydraulics. So they made it safely. And I said to Dad, let me get a pencil and paper. What the hell for? I said, Dad, this is good stuff. I'd like to write this down. The next week, I can't tell you why. I said to him, start at the beginning. And story after story after story rolled off of his tongue. And why this is so important is, up until that time, I didn't have the relationship with my father that I wanted.
Oh.
It was greatest generation. There was a roof over our head. There was food on the table. He was in bed down the hall, every night. But to sit down and have really intimate conversations about things, we didn't do that. Well, in the taking of these stories, there was a trust that began to build. And he opened up to me in ways that were magical. And so I say about that book that I got the dad I always wanted, and he got a daughter that he didn't know he had. So as a part of writing that, I learned so much more about my dad that I had never known. And thank you for your comments, because I would not have known just how active he was in the service of others if it hadn't been for that document and for the stories that he told me along the way. So the other piece of all of this is that we as children, if we want to have that relationship with our parents, it requires us to be open to listening. Now, I knew my father had been in the war, but I had no idea. He had never really spoken about it before. So that's the other piece of how I feel in the grief process. You know, it's like A, I got the dad I always wanted. B, I got to be with him when he passed away. C, I was able to help him die with dignity in the way that he wanted. So when it comes to the grief process, do I miss him? Oh, absolutely. Would I like to make one more pot roast dinner for him? Absolutely. Would I like to sit around the table and ask him a ton of questions that I never got to ask? Absolutely. But paradoxically, equal to the sorrow is an incredible sacred joy.
Mm.
And to have sacred joy in the grief process is really outstanding. And that's what those conversations about death and dying allowed me to experience when Dad finally passed away, was joy.
Yvonne, so I am hearing you encourage us, everyone listening in here today, to not cultivate those relationships closer to the end of life when we almost have this view that we are coming to an end of our life. It's have them as if every day is possibly that last day.
Mm-hmm.
And we tend to live in such fear of the future or the struggles and the pain of the past that we miss these moments now. What I love how you described the relationship with your dad was not always as intimate or as meaningful as it became closer to the end when you started to dabble in these sort of conversations. It was almost, let me get to know my dad, the real man behind the exterior or the persona that he presented to the world. You were always you, but how often do we miss the magical moments or the magic in actually having these beautiful relationships? And only when the person's close to passing or they attract a terminal illness do we almost start the grieving process already. And so you almost accelerated the grieving process, knowing that you are at peace. There's serenity in the short space of time. Almost you can never make up lost time, but there was an ability to be able to say, well, actually, I now understand. I can lead with radical compassion and empathy and understanding. And so if he wasn't what I thought he could have been for me previous years, or if he could not see that he had this daughter always here, it doesn't actually matter because I took the time to understand and listen and just lead with curiosity to know more. Beautiful.
Absolutely. When Dad told me his stories, and I don't remember in childhood that he ever attempted to do that. I knew that he flew a B-24. I knew it was a big plane, but I didn't know all of the other kinds of things. I knew where he grew up. I knew that his parents died. But there were opportunities where he started to talk. And as a youngster, I'm like, so what's the big deal? I want to go watch television or I want to go read a book. What I discovered in Dad through his stories, my father would get angry really quickly. For example, I went and asked him for 35 cents to go to a dance on a Saturday night, and he just blew up. And I did get the 35 cents. But in doing the stories, in getting underneath it all, I finally understood where that anger came from.
Mm-hmm.
And Dad came home from the war with PTSD. 3 years. Yep, 3 years of horrific nightmares, always the same. It's always the same nightmare. His plane's going down. He's trying to get to the spot where he can bail out. He's in a little tunnel and he can't pull himself through. And right at the edge of that tunnel is where he can then stand and drop out of the plane. He had those for 3 years. They were so bad that he ripped and tore channels in the mattress. And they finally had to, get a new mattress. I didn't know that. He was in his 60s when he went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is in Ohio. And he took a buddy specifically so that the buddy could see the plane that he flew, that Dad flew during the war. He walks up to the B-24. He's walking along the fuselage. He goes around the tail, and parked right beside it is a German jet. Dad dropped to the floor, totally out. Now that's a flashback. And when he came to, his friend said, "What happened, Dad?" Or "What happened, Mike?" And Dad said, "I don't know." So in the process of him telling me these stories, I got to hear about the nightmares. I got to hear about the flashback. Having training as a psychotherapist, I could explain those to him. I could explain to him why at the end of the war, the kind of knowledge and help that he could have received didn't exist because they didn't know it. So in that way, too, having the ability to help soothe this man that I so dearly loved was another gift, to be able to explain to him where and why things happened. But I do believe strongly that the anger I saw, not wholly responsible from World War II, but in large part because of the things that he saw and the things that he experienced.
Mm. Anissa mentioned a point about just having a short space of time where you have that connection, and you as well, Yvonne, where they share with you. And I found that with my mom as well, like it was just, we were apart. I was living in Australia, she was in South Africa. But in that 1 year, we wrote to each other constantly. And back then, there were no cell phones or anything. We were still using pen and paper. And those are some of my most treasured remembrances of my mom. And when I got back within a month, like I said, she had passed on. And I felt that in that year, despite the distance, our relationship was the closest that it had ever been. Because prior to that, I was my father's child. I was his little girl, and we had a very strong relationship, a very close relationship. Not so much with my mom, but that turned in that year. And I think following the years following her death, I got little snippets of her story, of her life journey from other people. And I so wished that I had gotten that from her. I wish that that was something that we shared. But what it's done is, even though I didn't have that from her, I've had it from other people. What it's done is it's changed me as a parent. It's changed the way that I relate to my son. It's changed the level of honesty that I have with him. It's changed the experiences that I've gone through. And oftentimes, I think we keep a lot away from our kids because we think that we're protecting them. But I think that that's a huge mistake, because in keeping stuff away, we are not exposing them to who we truly are as individuals. And it's so important for our kids to know who we are as human beings. So, in as much as I have that, I wouldn't say regret, but that yearning that I had learned all of this from my mum, it's really, really given me a gift in the person that I am and in the mum that I am to my child. So there's always golden nuggets or a silver thread that you can draw from any of your experiences, right? And it's about us finding those.
There was a therapist that I used to listen to a long time, and how she would capture what you just said is that sound mental health is the ability to contain the paradox. And on one side, you have the sorrow of not knowing, but on the other side, you have these little threads. And to be able to hold those two things in the same place is what healthy means. And then what you're now doing is you're carrying that to your children.
Yeah.
May I just interject and greet some guests on the Instagram? Seems to be full today. Thank you, Marguerite, Mariam, Shanaz, and Varna for joining us. And for those that don't necessarily interact, we know you are there watching. Please interact with us via your comments. Ronald, thank you for always being here. As I said to Yvonne earlier on, we do have people from the States that's here. So Ronald's from the USA as well. And he says that intimacy, he envies that, those exchanges. Thank you, ladies, for sharing your hearts. Thank you for giving your story, Yvonne. My father suffered alone. Saving Private Ryan would send him into hysterics. That's just one of the comments there. And Yvonne, I really want to get a sense of the book that you're talking about. It's a little bit close to heart for me as well, because I'm writing a memoir, and it is partly a bit of my mom and me being a product of whatever that is. I just don't want to give too much right now, but you've actually just inspired me to take a different angle, because the memoir is my account. It's how I, had the lens growing up and all the things that were happening. And I have some conversations with mom, and I have absolute grace for my mother for what she had gone through. But I can just imagine how that will be magnified, if that's the correct wording for it, because I haven't had these conversations with mom around her experience. And, we take on these intergenerational traumas as well. And I know that might not be apt for this conversation, but how wonderful would it be if we're having these intimate conversations to get understanding, so that we don't carry those traumas with us when the person has passed, because we got to have the candid, real, raw conversations with our mothers and fathers. Mm-hmm. Has that supported you? I'm not saying that that's necessarily your experience, but how has that helped you for any possible, not intergenerational trauma, but things that were not sitting well with you growing up?
It's helped me to transform them. I can't change what happened. And I'll say this, that the place I got through with therapy is that my parents did the best that they could do with what they had to work with at the time. Mm-hmm. And although there were hurts along the way, and although I might say, I wish it would have been different, I understand it. I understand that it is what it was, because that's what they were able to do. And that's helped me to heal. So I've also learned, having lost my brother, Mark was 26 when he died in 1978. And he and I were really, really close. And that process of losing him changed me in a way that when I grieved it, when I got through it, when I understood it, when I was, I don't think that acceptance is the last thing in the grief process. I think integration is the last thing in the grief process. When I was able to integrate that experience, I was able to feel very grounded in who I was and where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do with my life. And so in a strange way, I really appreciate that the process that I had to go through. You know, because it also made me go back to that statement of containing the paradox. It was really awful, but I learned so much about who I was, who we were, and who I wanted to be going forward. So I hope that answers the question.
It does. It does. So it was in service to you. What I'm hearing, Yvonne, sorry, Jamila, I just want to clarify that I understood it. So there's almost thanking the experiences, good, bad, or down, outright ugly, because they were in service to you regardless. Okay.
It makes the sunshine. It makes the sunshine brighter. It makes a positive relationship with another human being more beautiful. It makes looking at this funny little dog that we adopted, a rescue, it makes her more precious, if that makes sense. Jamila, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I think it just makes you appreciate everything a lot more sincerely and a lot more consciously, because we tend to just go through our lives, you know, like I said, just on autopilot most of the time. And these are the experiences that we have that make you stop dead in your tracks and realize what you should be concentrating on, what are the actual important things in life. But I think that also it affects you differently at different stages in your life as well. And when you start to experience death and loss of a loved one in your life. I lost my mom when I was 18 years old, and having to deal with that loss at that age brought on its own challenges and complexities and misunderstandings, and you know that then translated into failed relationships with loved ones, with family members, you know, because you're coming from a different space of grief and sorrow and oftentimes anger. And especially if the death has been one that you could not have foreseen, you know, something that's been sudden. I lost my brother quite tragically when I was in my 30s. And that was taken by me or experienced by me in a different way because I was different at that point. You know, maybe I had come to that realization already about stopping and smelling the roses and realizing what's important and showing appreciation for that. So my grief took on a different form then. And then later on in my life, in my late 40s, I lost my dad in COVID. And the beauty of that is that we had a strained relationship because of prior history, and we from the little girl that I was, you know, I was almost like the son that my dad dreamt of having as a teenager and a tomboy. And then going into my years where I was getting married, where our relationship completely broke down. It broke down even further when I went through my divorce. But when I got to that point where he was ready to leave, it was a totally different experience because I could go to him and thank him for all of the beautiful memories that he gave me when, you know, I grew up, that I would never have had it not been for him. So it allowed me to look at my life through those eyes of appreciation and the relationship through that. And I was fortunate enough, even though it was COVID, to be able to go and see him in the hospital and relate all of these beautiful memories, and to be able to thank him and get my son on a video call and get him to thank him for whatever he felt grateful for. And it just gives you a sense of closure that I never had with the other two losses that I experienced.
Yes. One of the things that happened with the second book, I asked people to read it before it was published. And two stories that come out of that. And man in his 80s read it and then said to me, I didn't know I needed to do this. So I need to get the 5 wishes. I need to get those things together. And on his birthday, he said to his 2 daughters, I want us to Zoom. And the only thing I want to talk about is my 5 wishes. That's my birthday gift. So they're on the Zoom call and they're going through it. And he wanted to be cremated. So one of the daughters said, well, what do you want us to do with your ashes? He said, oh, throw them over the bridge. At that point, what does it matter? Well, they said, hey, Dad, wouldn't you like to have them scattered at the old farm? He said, well, that's too much trouble. And the response was, well, what if we would like to do that? What if we would like to go back to the old farm and that's where your ashes would go? And he said, you'd really want to do that for me? And they said, yes. Well, he went and changed that part of the 5 wishes. So having that discussion now, when he passes, there's a totally different shift in it for both him and for his daughters. The second one is that one of the women in my writers group was really acutely ill and had been for 10 years. And she purchased the 5 wishes. She did it. She sat down and talked it over with her family. They were in agreement with what she was requesting. And I got a call to let me know that she had chosen palliative care. She had chosen hospice. So her husband made it possible for us to talk for 15 minutes on a Zoom call. I didn't say much of anything. She just kept saying, oh, thank you, Yvonne. The 5 wishes are great. I've talked it over with my family. They know I'm ready. I know I'm ready. It's all really peaceful. I just so appreciate that you took me to that opportunity so that my family and I could do this thing together. And I think 3 days later, we heard that she had passed. So having those opportunities for those kinds of discussion, I know changed the grieving process. They did for you. They can do that for all of us. So talking about death and dying doesn't have to be the elephant in the room.
Yes.
Doesn't have to be.
I mean,
Talk about your
so many.
Yeah.
So many of us don't even find the courage to draw up a will, let alone speaking about death. And these are such important things to do. Go on, you were saying?
Agreed. So I want to get to your second book, because the first one was Flying with Dad, and the second one was called
Dying with Dad. Tough talks
Dying
for easier endings.
Yes.
And it's a memoir, and it's the stories from when I was little about how I experienced death and dying. And then it goes through, again, the 5 wishes and writing with my father and my father's passing and my grief experience. It was actually asked for when I talked to readers who had read the first book. They were surprised. Where did you find the courage? Didn't you want him to continue to live? How did you have the energy to do what you did? And I stopped to think about that. And it wasn't a question in my head. When the time was there, my father asked me to do something. He asked to go out of his house feet first. I went on automatic pilot. I mean, here was an opportunity for me to give one of the most powerful gifts to my dad that I could. So that's the impetus for dying with Dad.
Okay. We have about 10 minutes remaining. There's one comment here from Pramod, and he says, wow, this seems like such an interesting session. I just came across it. Pramod, just please go and listen from the start, because it is a beautiful, beautiful, insightful conversation that Yvonne brings to this segment this week. And I think for me, I am deeply inspired and have so many different ideas going through my mind, because I have this conversation almost often. And now there's a different lightness that I can bring to it for the kids' sake. And instead of us waiting to acknowledge and recognize each other, as your dad said, why must it be when I'm past and people are saying something about me? Maybe that's another way we could start, not the grieving process, but the celebration process, so that when the person passes, we know we've exchanged these beautiful sentiments that we have for one another. So something I'm going to start, and I encourage those that are listening, is actually to once a week, it doesn't have to be every day, but once a week, we sit down as a family and say, what do I really appreciate about you? Or also, what didn't sit well with me? Get it out. So that, because death is so sudden, Jamila, you were talking about mom coming from a funeral and a month later, her passing. So I'm almost wanting to do a memoir in the live format with my family, with my kids, and create this ritual around. I don't know, maybe my daughter will want to write it down. I don't know. She's 13 years old. I'm going to mention, and I'm going to tell her to listen to the segment. But I just think it's such a beautiful idea to take this forward for families out there. And it can bring a different energy and dynamic to so many households. Thoughts, Jamila and Yvonne?
I don't know what the laws are in South Africa, but I do know here in the United States that I could not have done what I did for Dad if I didn't have a legal document giving me permission to do that. So I would suggest to you and your audience to check that out, because that experience way back, there was a legal document. It was signed. It was a different state. You know, doctors in our country can't proceed. They have to try and save a life, even though that person on the table in front of them may not want that, because there's no legal document that says what it needs to say. So put it in writing in whatever way it's required.
Well, that's very interesting, Anissa. I'm not sure what the legal requirements are here in South Africa, but if anyone is watching and has some sort of understanding of the legalities around that, we'd appreciate it if you could just pop it into our comments, and it would help us to be able to navigate, you know, if that is the part that our loved one would like to take. But in speaking about our lives and leaving behind a legacy or a story, Anissa, I think that's so important, and it's quite cathartic, I think, an experience for everybody who's involved. And yes, I would definitely encourage that, because it's so important, because our stories do matter, and they matter at every stage in our lives, and they take on a different shape or form at different stages. And it's so important to be able to document that, and not just for ourselves so that we can change and better who we are, but for those that we have left behind, our dependents, our kids, for our siblings even to understand us better, because oftentimes we don't have the best of relationships, right? Because speaking to one another doesn't often come across in the best way possible. But if someone were to sit down and read your story, Anissa, like what you are going to be doing, it gives you such a
Mm,
deep understanding of who you are as a person, because it's coming from a sincere, truthful, pure, and honest place.
mm,
So
mm.
I would definitely say that those are absolutely absolute game changers, I would say, in how we live our lives and the ones that we have around us.
Yvonne, we've got, thank you, Jamila. I appreciate that, firstly. I'm quite ecstatic to go and put it into practice and figure out how to bring it across to kids that might not grasp this because they hate having the conversation around death. They're always telling me, stop talking about it, Mom. Anyway, so we have 4 minutes remaining, Yvonne, and you spoke about integration. And so the context that you used integration around was how do we integrate grief into our lives? But what would you leave for our audience to as strategies and tips in doing so?
Grieving is work. It's hard work. Um, the important things is, if it's not going well for you, find a grief group. If it's not going well for you, reach out to someone who specializes in grief counseling. I have done what's called critical incident stress debriefing, which is going out and working with groups when they have been a part of a traumatic event, bank robbery, children or students being shot, even in this little small town that I live in. So you gather these people around and you ask questions. How are you reacting now? Or how did you react when the event happened, and how are you reacting now? The next part is an educational piece. And you talk about behaviors that you may be experiencing, and they're all normal. And your feelings are all normal. And your thoughts are all normal. And to know that, when Mom died, I was so angry. I was so angry because she did alone. But I knew that my anger was normal, that I wasn't ready to be pulled off to the funny farm. To know the normalcy of the process, because it's so hauntingly deep sometimes that we begin to wonder, is there something really wrong with me? So I can say this about Dad. When Dad came home from the war, he walked around our little town, saw all these guys that he knew who had been in the war themselves. They all looked fine. So he began to question what was wrong with him, that he was feeling the kinds of things and having these nightmares, when that was part of the process of what I told him. It's normal. So understanding that things are normal, understanding that it's going to be a rocky road, understanding that you need to give yourself a gift of time, knowing that those close to you are not going to grieve in the same way. On the day that we buried my brother, my mother was supposed to be directing Sweet Adeline Chorus. Well, she didn't. Her quartet came to the house and they sang for us. And my brother and my sister and I, we were enthralled. My father was livid. Why don't people just get out of here? Why don't they just go alone, go home? I want to be alone. I was really angry with that at the time. But now, knowing what I know, my dad was grieving in his own way. So giving people different distances to do it differently. And if you want to be helpful, listen. If someone talks to you about the hurt, about the loss, please don't say you shouldn't feel like that. Please don't pull it away from them. just say, keep talking to me. I want to understand what it's like for you. So that for me is healthy grieving. That is what eventually will get us to the place where it's integrated. And the other day, a song came on, and I was in tears. It was something my brother and I shared. It's normal. It's normal. So that's how I would finish it: is to know that it's all normal, but to know that it's sometimes really helpful to get help to get through it. Because I wasn't taught in school how to grieve. I had no idea what would be normal and what wouldn't be normal. I hope that answers the question.
It does. And I want to thank you, Yvonne. I want to thank you for just being an amazing, phenomenal woman, sharing the story with us, being sort of spearheading these conversations and creating more awareness around this, because it's something that is not spoken about enough. And it's been such a beautiful exchange. So I am going to say thank you, and really just we want to hear more of this in the future. I don't know when we'll have you on again. Maybe the third book. Maybe there's a third book or a fourth book. I don't know. But deep gratitude for being here with us today, Yvonne.
Well, thank you for allowing me to tell my story. I really appreciate, and particularly, like I said earlier, South Africa. It's a long way away, but here we are.
Yeah, no, we must actually thank you so much for sharing your story and for opening up the channels for being able to speak about death in such a soft, inviting, kind and gentle way. Like we said, we normally just don't want to hear anything about it, but you've allowed us, or you've shown us a way on how we can look at it from a different perspective, and as much as a celebration of life rather than the ending of something.
Thank you.
So thank you, and we hope to see you soon back on our podcast. Yeah, thank you, Anissa. It's been an hour gone by again so quickly.
Yvonne, do stay with us. I'm going to end the live. Thank you for the guests that have stayed the course of the hour. Thank you, as always, Ronald, for embracing us with your presence, and everyone else that's joined here today. And for those that are going to watch the replay, don't hesitate to get in touch with Yvonne. Her details are definitely somewhere will be in the comments. And we'll also put those 5 wishes link in there. So thank you for being here. I'm going to end the live now. Any last comments on your side, Yvonne, before I say goodbye?
Just another thank you.
It's our pleasure.
It's been a pleasure.